So let me now give the word to Erin Anderson to hear a little bit from the SBA perspective.
Great.
So
Thank you.
I'll help you put up the slides. There we go.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? All right. Because this is the second to last thing this afternoon, I want to ask a question of the audience just so I can get an idea of who's out there. How many folks kind of consider themselves practitioners, economic developers, administrators of clusters? Can you raise your hand? Okay. And how many probably from the academic world? Okay. So 50-50. I ask this because I think for me personally, trying to understand clusters, combining those two has been a huge challenge. I want to take a step back. I grew up with a father who was an economic developer in the 1980s. So I remember going to city council meetings, and he would get really excited when they attracted or stole business from another state or local county. And we all remember those days. And it's been a huge shift. And I think for me, in my own career, it's been interesting to see that shift. And it really became evident to me. I was in Iowa in the governor's office, and we had lost Maytag. Maytag had left the state, and we were trying to build the wind energy industry and having some real challenges. And the former governor, who's now the Secretary of Agriculture, Governor Vilsack, had started clusters. Like, he had started kind of this cluster concept. So we inherited this, and it was really exciting. But I remember getting into, we got into office, and we were trying to sell clusters to our state legislature. And let me just tell you, when you sell when you sell academics to politics, like to folks who are politicians, it's somewhat challenging, especially when you talk about clusters. The name in itself is a wonderful name, and I love clusters, but it's difficult to understand until you actually see it in practice. So, I spent a lot of time, and I was really excited, about learning about the impact of clusters, and to me, it was common sense. My father had always told me, problem solving, that's the most important thing. There are a lot of, smart people are important, but being able to problem solve, that is the most important thing. And I have to tell you, I think when I saw clusters as a tool, it was one of those things that just made sense. It was problem-oriented, it wasn't program-oriented, and it really, you could see the impact on industries and small businesses in the area. But I think the biggest challenge, and this is a challenge that I've seen not only in local government and state government and now in federal government, is branding that impact. And that's something that we really when Karen came into office, I came to the SBA in 2010, and we were in the process of launching the Clusters program. And I think her leadership with regards to the evaluation of clusters really helped with that brand, at least as we had to sell it on the Hill. And I know for folks who've dealt with their state legislators, that selling is so key, and the best way to sell it is showing the impact to small businesses and showing the impact to your local supply chain, and getting industry on board. So I wanted to just first, I think I've got a couple of slides, and I'll be quick, but we talked a little bit ago. I mean, look, these are where all of the federal clusters are right now. So we've really grown a program over the course of the last few years, EDA, SBA. There have been a significant amount of growth in numerous industries, and the amount has been very significant. But I think for us coming in 2010, a huge challenge, and it continues to be a challenge, is number one, the branding and selling what clusters are, not only to get government funding, but to get industry partners on board. And those industry partners really need to be the advocates. You're not going to be successful if you have some government money, and that's it. You're not going to be sustainable if you have some government money, and that's it. So for the SBA, it was targeting clusters that were established because we knew that they had that industry buy-in. And for us as an agency, it was really looking at the impact on the small businesses, because as I'd been in the space for about 6 or 7 years, we always kind of push the evaluation conversation aside. There are all these breakouts and roundtables on evaluation, and but we'd always say, it's 5 or 10 years, so it just takes a while, have faith. Well, I can tell you from SBA's perspective, the Hill did not like that response. So we were tasked with giving funding out. We started out, as Scott had mentioned, with a pilot program, and we used a contract mechanism. We had to be very entrepreneurial because we didn't have funding for it. But that challenge, and Karen being there and really pushing the metrics conversation, was really, really helpful for us, I think, and the long-term sustainability of being able to fund these types of cluster initiatives. Because we had to, we went back the first year, and you know how Congress is, have faith. These work, we know they work. So thank goodness with Optimal Solutions, we were able to work with them to really show that impact to small businesses. And having those messages, an increase in revenues by 23%, an increase of employment by 18%. And while we're still experimenting and figuring out how to perfect that evaluation, those talking points did so much for SBA's program and investment in clusters. So I also then wanted to shift, because we have our contract clusters, but we also have our interagency clusters that Phil had mentioned earlier. And I wanted to kind of just bring up a couple of things we see on the horizon in the future. I mean, obviously there have been a lot of challenges that we've worked through, but we think we're in a really great place now where we've identified a model that works, and we're kind of ready to move forward in a couple of different arenas. But the interagency cluster has been a challenge. I mean, it's been a challenge from a funding perspective. It's been a challenge from a lot of the red tape. So I think as a federal government, there are some opportunities in identifying ways that we can work together more easily as agencies to make it easier for the grantee on the back end as well. So that's one thing in the future we're looking at. Another for SBA is to continue to look at ways we impact the small business. Every clusters, we have the workforce, we have the worker, we have the educators, we have community colleges, we have everyone at play. For SBA, the message has really been, how are we impacting, GDP? How are we impacting small businesses? How are we impacting, this arena of things? And looking at it is a problem-oriented type of solution rather than a program. And the federal government, that's sometimes a challenge because we have programs that we have to put funding through. And oftentimes you all on the ground know what the problem is, and the funding doesn't always fit the problem. So we need to do a better job of figuring out how to work together more effectively to lift some of that red tape and really solve some of those problems. And I wanted to bring up one other thing. I think there's been a huge opportunity. As earmarks have gone away, some were good, some were not so good, but I think there are a lot of federal cluster initiatives that, got funding locally. And there hasn't been a good conversation, I think, until recently on the national level of what these different cluster initiatives are doing. So when you talk to your congressperson, they'll know that organization, but they won't know it's a cluster. They won't know, the type of organization it is. So the more we can have a national conversation around cluster initiatives and looking at it as a program in some ways that needs to be there, I think will be helpful to folks on the ground as well as to SBA. Another thing I think we can look at is the types of investments that we make. These are our clusters, our 10 contract clusters, and we looked at the size is the economic activity. It shows the industry, but then the type of activities that those clusters are using with SBA money, what's successful. And this is after 1 year, so we have, it'll take a little while to identify what the impact will be. But where are we getting more bang for our buck? Are there certain industries where showcasing will make a bigger difference? And how do we define some of those, or target, some of those funding opportunities with regards to where we're seeing the impact? And then finally, I think one other place where I personally, I just took over our Office of Women's Business Ownership, so I personally think that there's a huge opportunity here. Looking at how we use clusters to get populations that aren't in a lot of industries into those industries. So for women specifically, we have a huge investment in STEM, but how are we actually getting those women to start businesses and patent things in these types of industries where there are gaps in the supply chain and where women could easily fill those gaps? So are there outreach strategies that different clusters could be using to increase the diversity in that specific industry? So I think for us, from a federal agency perspective, there's a huge opportunity there. And then finally, in high growth industries, targeting which industries we're going to have the biggest bang for our buck with taxpayer money. So those are just a few things, food for thought, background, but things have changed. I mean, I think we don't give ourselves credit, but things have changed a lot over the last decade. We can now show numbers, whereas before we were saying have faith. So I think that we've come a long way. We've come a long way.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Erin. I think a lot of common issues here in looking at metrics, looking at data, looking at facts, and see how they relate those issues. So I made a couple of notes on things that, if you look forward, are really important. So first of all, indeed, enhancing these mechanisms for tracking things, and I'm encouraged to see how SBA is also looking at program evaluation, not just saying the cluster itself, but how do the instruments have an impact. It was very interesting. Here you talk about women and other issues. How can we use clusters maybe as a delivery tool, or cluster organizations as a delivery tool for things that we haven't been able to be as effective as we'd like to. And then finally, I think you just hinted at that a little bit, but we might get at the back end of the discussion more to that, the selection issue. How can we get better at picking those type of clusters, constellations, groups that create returns?